Welcome back to Proxy Hammer, everybody. And today we're going to be doing a little bit of a different video. We're going to be doing a video looking at the inspiration behind the Craftworld Eldar. And we're going to be looking at where history and mythology meets Warhammer 40k fluff. Now, a lot of you might be thinking, well, the 40k fluff is a completely unique blend of totally new stuff that the creators just came up with out of nowhere, right? And to be honest with you guys, whenever you guys look at any game, whether it be fantasy or science fiction, most of the stuff in there is not original. Now, I'm not going to say that's for all things, but human beings in general love to basically reference things that other people can relate to that happened in the past, right? So whenever you look at anything fantasy or 40k or science fiction or anything related to those things, you're always going to find comparisons between that stuff and real things that happened in the past. Real things that happen in history and mythology that the writers can access to tell unique stories, but at the same time, make you feel like it's almost familiar, right? Now, there's a reason a lot of us, when we look at Eldar models, we reminisce about something that maybe we saw in school or maybe we saw in history class or an old historical video game that we used to play. And that gives us a little bit of nostalgia and makes us think that even though we're dealing with a completely alien race that is totally different from us and actually looks down on humans, which the Eldar very much do look down on humans in the fluff, we can still find some familiarity in what they look like and who they are. So let's get right into it. And what we're basically going to be doing in this video is we're going to be looking at what historical inspiration do Eldar draw from, because the writers of the 40k fluff, especially the Eldar, were very much influenced by history and mythology. And we're going to be looking at the ancient Greek versus Eldar armor comparison as well, and we're also going to be looking at the Greek versus Eldar pantheon to show that there are numerous similarities. And just to let you know, just think about it from a logical perspective for a second. The writers of 40k probably grew up loving things like history and mythology and all that kind of stuff. It makes sense that when they created their own game and when they created stories for their own game, they would reach into those things that were familiar to them that they liked growing up and put elements of that into their own story. So, the real question is, what historical inspiration did the writers of the 40k fluff, especially the Eldar, draw from? And what I have found through reading, and because I'm kind of a history guy myself, I studied history in school and so forth. I'm not an expert in history or anything like that, but I do know a little bit about history, especially the ancient Greeks and Romans. So, basically, the Eldar draw a lot of their inspiration from the ancient Greeks. And this starts off with the idea that the ancient Greeks had these things called city-states, which were basically these separate autonomous states, that had their own autonomy but worked together when needed with other city-states in Greece. So in ancient Greece, it wasn't one empire ruled by one person. It was multiple different small city-states that operated independently and often got in fights with each other. So there was this idea of independence in Greece. Each city-state had its independence and controlled certain areas around it. And this often got the ancient Greeks in a lot of trouble with each other, and they often feuded a lot, and eventually would lead to their downfall after several wars with each other, the most notable of which was the Athens and Sparta War, which left the ancient Greeks exceptionally devastated. The next thing is the words that we see printed in the Eldar Codex. The words like exarch and autarch are actually both ancient Greek words used to describe leaders and rulers, the latter of which, the autarch, being used as a derogatory term for a despot or a monarch. The ancient Greeks, especially the Athenians, did not like the idea of a monarch or despot. However, there were some city-states that did have kings and so forth, like Sparta, that did rule a different way. So there's different city-states with different ideologies at some points. But the words exarch and autarch are both derived from ancient Greek. And lastly, you might remember from a couple of movies or stuff like that about the Oracle of Delphi, right? And this was basically a oracle that was renowned for predicting the future. And this is not unlike a lot of Eldar farseers and so forth, right? Reading the skeins of fate. So, again, there's a lot of inspiration that is drawn directly from the ancient Greeks, from their mythology, their stories, and their history, that the writers of the Eldar Fluff included in their essentially stories, right? About the Eldar and how they were formed and so forth. And actually, and I'll go into this a little bit, but even their gods are very similar, and the way that their gods operated with and against each other is very similar to how Greek gods interacted with each other in the mythologies. But that's not where the similarities stop. When we look at ancient Greek versus Eldar armor, for example, we see that there's very much a close correlation. Both sport hair crests, which were essentially, well, for the ancient Greeks, horsehair crests that stuck out of the helmet in order to intimidate the enemy, essentially. This made the Greek warriors look a lot taller than they actually were, and it was a way to kind of intimidate enemies and present a much more frightening look to adversaries. In addition to that, they also had conical-shaped helmets as well, and this was to a very similar effect, and you can see that the Eldar have the exact same type of helmets, just in a more futuristic version of basically what the ancient Greeks had. The most notable thing you can see this on is actually dire Avengers, right? They have the hair crests that look very Greek in origin. And even the exarch has a small chin-like protrusion, which is actually not Greek in origin, but Egyptian. So they took a little bit of Greek and a little bit of Egyptian and kind of mixed it together for the look on the exarch. And when we read the fluff about the body armor that the Eldar wear, and we look at the body armor that the Greeks wore, the cuirass, both of those body armors were fitted to allow the wearer more mobility when fighting while still being durable. The cuirass was usually made of bronze or sometimes leather, would be made in many layers, and sometimes the body armor was also what we call anatomical. And this was to show the idealized body that the Greeks essentially thought was idealized, right? And we have the muscles, the six-pack, and we can see this on the Eldar models as well. We can see that most Eldar models have six-packs. Most Eldar models have, built pectorals and stuff like that, like they've been at the gym all day, right? Now, this wasn't a coincidence. The Greeks and later the Romans would use cuirasses and body armor like this to essentially, again, another form of intimidation, right? If you know that the enemy you're going against is a very muscular, in-shape human being, you might be a little bit intimidated by that, right? And this was also to show the idealized form of what they thought was idealized, at least, of the human body. A little bit elitist, if you ask me, and also the attitudes of the Eldar and the ancient Greeks were also very similar. The ancient Greeks thought themselves superior in both mind and body to a lot of other peoples, including the peoples to the north of them and the Persians to the east, as well as the Romans to the west. They thought they were the superior mental and physical superior of those different peoples. Now, obviously, this was complete bullshit, right? There are no people who are superior to other people, but the ancient Greeks had this idea that they were superior. They were the superior version of humanity when compared to other peoples like Persians or the Dacians to the north, or, basically any other people that weren't Greeks. Let's just put it that way. The ancient Greeks also had a few things to say about the Macedonians to their immediate north. But of course, as we know, the Macedonians under Alexander united the Greeks and actually conquered a lot of territory. So, even in their attitudes, the ancient Greeks are very similar to the Eldar in that the Eldar are very elitist as well and often look down on other races as inferior to themselves. So there's a lot of similarities there with the ancient Greeks and with the Eldar in attitudes as well. And here we can see a quick comparison of an Eldar Dire and a Greek hoplite. So hoplite is a term they used for their warriors. It basically refers to the hoplon, which was a round shield that covered most of the body. And this was the most important piece of equipment for a hoplite because not only would it cover him, but it would cover the man to his side and protect them. So essentially, hoplites fought in very tight formations, and everybody was protecting each other, basically to support one another in battle, which was a semi-unique way of fighting during that period of time, which allowed for more effective battle maneuvers and tactics. Because remember, when you are fighting together, supporting one another, you're going to be a much more effective fighting force than if you're just fighting alone and not supporting each other in battle. So this is another thing also that I think Eldar really lean on as far as their battle tactics and strategies. They really need other Eldar units to be supporting them to be effective because every Eldar is a specialized unit. Which again, isn't quite the same as hoplites because of course hoplites were all armed with the same thing. But the fact of the matter is they had to support each other to be effective and had to be used in tight formations. And Eldar do need to support each other just like hoplites do. And here's another example of a type of helmet that the Greek hoplites wore. It was a conical shaped helm, and as you can see with the fire dragon comparison, they are almost exactly the same. You can definitely see that there's some resemblances here of the helmets, which the Greeks wore, and the helmets that the Eldar sport. And here's a quick comparison of Greek body armor, the cuirass, and Eldar body armor, at either aspect armor or guardian armor or what have you. All of it is segmented, and of course, it is anatomical, which means that it is representative of the idealized body. And of course, the Eldar would use this as well. Now, if you notice, other factions don't really have this, right? It's only really Eldar and Dark Eldar that utilize this type of body armor. You don't see Space Marines in body armor like this showing their pecs and everything like that and showing their six-packs. Although we probably know that Space Marines all pretty much have six-packs and probably pretty big muscles because, they're hopped up on all sorts of steroids and stuff like that. But with the Eldar, we see this. So again, this is basically a direct reference to ancient Greek and Roman anatomical body armor. However, the references don't stop there. We also see many references to the different Eldar gods as well as the Greek gods, and we see many close comparisons. Now, obviously, not all of the gods are going to be the same. The writers want to make some differences between the gods and not make them just carbon copies of each other. But there are some similarities. Like, for example, when we look at Azurian and Apollo, both of these gods represent light and fire, or the sun, right? Both held enormous power amongst the gods and were great warriors themselves. Azurian, of course, was one of the greatest warriors of the Eldar, and Apollo was also one of the greatest warriors amongst the gods. And although Apollo would often choose sides in conflict of the mortals, Azurian was often neutral. So this is a difference that the writers distinguished, sometimes to a fault. For example, when we look at the war in heaven, which was the big war that the Eldar gods had, which eventually led to their essential weakening and demise, essentially Azurian let Kurnos and Isha, which were two other Eldar gods, bear the wrath of Cain, his twin brother. So, of course, Cain was a war god, and he was cheated in a deal, and he was pissed about it. So he went after several other gods for revenge, including Vol, the smith god, which we'll talk about, and Eldanesh, who was a mortal Eldar warrior, and essentially the greatest among the Eldar mortals, whom he killed, and in punishment, Azurman basically made Cain's hand drip with blood for the remainder of his days. And you can also see that, a lot of these stories have revenge laced within them and pride, right? And this is what a lot of the Greek stories about the gods had as well. And if you read Greek mythology and read some of these stories, you start to think that, even though these aren't exactly the same, there's a lot of similarities in the way these stories are being told, and there's a lot of similarities in the traits of these gods. Gods, right? And even the lessons learned from the stories are very similar to the lessons learned in the stories of the Greek gods. For example, next we see the comparison between Vol, the Eldar smith god, and Hephaestus, who is the Greek god of smiths and craftsmen. And basically, both of these gods both forged the arms and armor of the gods themselves. They were very powerful, and they made very powerful weapons. However, both were maimed and crippled in similar ways. In one interpretation, Hephaestus was actually crippled by his own father Zeus when he was thrown down, and Vol by Cain himself during the War of Heaven after Cain had found out that Vol had tricked him. And essentially the story is pretty funny. Essentially Cain wanted weapons, and Vol promised to forge him 100 weapons of basically masterless quality, right? But Vol ran out of time, and he couldn't forge all of them. So what he did was he replaced one of the swords in the bunch with a mortal sword, and gave these to Cain in exchange for Isha and Kurnos, I believe, whom Cain captured. Now, I may be a little bit wrong on that. My fluff's not exactly 100%, but I think that's what it was. And Cain accepted the deal, and when the trade was made, Cain found out much later that one of the swords was actually a fake, and at this point, he wanted to get his vengeance against Vol. Vol took up one of his own blades and fought very valiantly against Cain, but unfortunately, Cain was a much more powerful warrior and defeated Vol, crippling him. So, again, these stories are much similar to each other, right? Hephaestus basically was maimed by his own father in a battle, which I won't go into why, and there's reasons why I won't go into why about it, but if you're interested, you should look up why Hephaestus was injured by Zeus. But if you are interested, I'm not going to go into the reasons. There's a lot of weird stuff in Greek mythology that I just don't want to go into on this channel, but check it out if that does interest you. But essentially, there's a lot of similarities here, right? Hephaestus was maimed by his own father, Zeus, another god, and Vol was also maimed by Cain himself, another god. And lastly, we have the comparison between Isha and Demeter. Both are goddesses of harvest and fertility. Both spent time imprisoned in vile places, right? So Isha, we know from the 40k fluff, was imprisoned in Nergal's garden after the birth of Slaanesh. Basically what happened here was Isha was at first captured by Slaanesh, and then Nergal waged a war against Slaanesh in order to capture Isha for his own desires. So essentially, Nurgle uses Isha now as a pet to test diseases on and stuff like that. And Demeter was actually imprisoned by her own father Cronus in his stomach. That's right. Cronus ate her because he was afraid that she, as well as her other siblings, would overtake him and eventually depose him as a ruler. And I believe Demeter was actually eventually freed by Zeus. And if you're, again, I'm not going to go into, their relationship and stuff like that. If you do want to look into it, though, I recommend, going on the internet and doing a quick Google search between the relationship between Demeter and Zeus. I think you'll find it a little bit interesting and weird. But yeah, essentially, they had a lot of family issues. Let's just put it that way. And lastly, both Demeter and Isha went through terrible lengths to save the ones that they love. Demeter with her daughter Persephone, and that story is actually pretty interesting because Hades, the god of the underworld, captured Persephone, and Demeter, who was the god of the harvest, essentially left behind all of her duties, causing the world to be in famine to find her daughter in the underworld. And I think Zeus actually had to pick up the slack after Demeter left and basically take control of her duties for a while. And Isha also goes through terrible lengths to protect the Eldari. Even still, she is trapped in the Nurgle garden. Even still, as the diseases riddle her body with pox and other things, she whispers the secrets to cures for these diseases that Nurgle releases upon the universe, in the hope that they may be found and used to save Eldari lives. And also, just as a side note, Isha is probably the most compassionate of the Eldar gods because she doesn't only care about just Eldar or the other Eldar gods, but she also cares about all living life itself. So in conclusion, I think although there are a few differences in the Eldar lore with the mythology and history of the ancient Greeks, there are strikingly many similarities that go beyond just pure coincidence. The creators of the Eldar lore and the writers no doubt took huge aspects from Greek history and applied them rather liberally to the fluff of the Eldar in many ways. Also to the aesthetic of the Eldar. And the result of this is an absolutely fantastic mosaic of familiar stories that continue to capture our imaginations. And like I said, I think the coolest thing about Warhammer isn't that everything is completely unique, right? I think the coolest thing about Warhammer and the lore and the fluff and stuff like that is the fact that a lot of these inspirations are drawn from historical sources that we find familiarity in. And because of that, we can relate more to it. For example, Greek mythology. A lot of it we're not going to be able to relate to, let's be honest. There's a lot of weird stuff in there that when you read it, you're like, wait a second, who are they related to? Right? There's a lot of weird stuff. But the stories themselves contain lessons about life and the dangers of things like pride in our actions. Which, by the way, both the Greeks and the Eldar fell as a result of pride. And even when we look at people like, for example, Greek figures, not only in the mythology, but actual Greek figures, a lot of the stories that are told about them are lessons in caution, right? They're cautionary tales. And to give you guys an example of a character, or actually a real person in history, who was a victim of his own pride, was that of Alexander the Great. Now, Alexander the Great, many of you know as a great strategist in general, but most of all, he was a human being, and he had many, many flaws, one of which was his absolute pride. Alexander the Great could not stand an insult, and he could not stand being told that he was wrong. Now, to give you an example of this, Alexander the Great fought side by side with many men whom he disagreed with that had ideologies closer to his father. And these men often gave him advice to follow, which he ignored. Now, he had great success in battle, but in some instances, Alexander the Great would think and come to believe that many of his own advisors were against him. And in his pride in thinking that they were against him and they were against what he was trying to build, he had quite a few of them killed, including his own friend, who he fought side by side with and who protected him in battle, saved his life in battle. He killed this man because he disagreed with Alexander, and he disagreed with the direction that Alexander was taking the army and his empire. And because of this, Alexander started a descent into a never-ending cycle of war and conquest in which a lot of his own soldiers disagreed with. And eventually, because of this, Alexander had to delay a lot of his plans of conquest, and eventually, this would lead to his downfall when he was inspecting some defenses. He caught typhoid fever and subsequently died as a result. Now again, this is a story of somebody whose conquests would have never ended. He was still a very young man when he died, and his conquest would have continued. He had plans for the Roman Empire, who was, very small at the time, and they weren't really an empire at the time, so Alexander probably would have been able to conquer them. And he also had dreams of conquering not only India, but China as well, because he had heard rumors of an empire even greater than that of India farther to the east. And Alexander, his dreams of conquest basically could never be sated. And, I have a lot of thoughts about Alexander as a person who likes history. But what I can tell you for sure is that Alexander was a victim of his own pride. Not only did he kill his closest advisors and cut them off, but he also partook in the horrible act of reading his soldiers' letters that they sent back home to their families to try to root out anybody who was against him. And this often led to people resenting Alexander and the endless conquest that he strove to fight for. All right, everybody. That's going to be it for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed a little bit of that. And again, I'm not an expert historian or an expert on 40K fluff, but I just wanted to show you guys a couple of the similarities that I found when reading and that inspired me when I was really starting to understand and get to like Eldar as a faction many, many years ago now. So I hope you enjoyed, and if you want to, leave a comment in the comment section if you have something to add to this, or if you noticed I made a mistake in either my historical analysis or, my analysis of the Eldar fluff. Just let me know in the comments, or if you want anything to add yourself, please feel free to do so. I'd love to hear it. All right, everybody, that's it for today. Peace out. See you guys later. Have a good one.